Hello. My name's Emily if you're new here, and welcome to my video on what books I recommended out of the 150 plus that I read this year. I'm going to offer an explanation that nobody's really asking, but you may be thinking, didn't you read this book? Didn't you read that book? I read a lot of series this year, and I wanted to just do everything in one video, but when it got down to it, there were a lot of 4-star series that I read this year, so I'm going to do those separately. This is just going to be either standalone or books from a series where maybe only one existed at the point in time when I read it. In the series video, I will do anything that was like 2 or more books that I read in a series this year. So now that the question nobody asked has been answered, I'm going to try to do these by genre. I typically read heavy on the fantasy, heavy on the thriller. I will read romance every now and again. And I also have a few historical fiction books thrown in here, surprisingly. I read quite a few this year, and there were a lot that I really enjoyed. So I'm going to start with historical fiction. The first book I want to talk about is Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. This was a Christmas gift last year from my sister. It was Barnes & Noble Book of the Year, or it was like a finalist for Book of the Year last year. And when she saw the synopsis, she thought I would love it. Personally, as a woman in STEM, anytime that I see like a strong woman or the representation for women in STEM in a book that's accurate, I'm very interested in reading it. This book takes place in the 60s, and our main character is Elizabeth Zott. She is a chemist, and this follows her through experiences she had while she was in school, as well as working in a laboratory. Now, obviously, I know things were a lot different in the 60s, but this really shows the struggles that women still to this day deal with, maybe not as these extremes, but still are dealing with today in male-dominated fields. I loved how the main character in this book took a bad situation and made it better for herself. There was a lot of things that happened to her that shaped who she was, not only as a person, but as a scientist. So I don't want to get too detailed in any of these descriptions. I just want to let you know that these are the books that I really enjoyed. And the why for this one is just because of how it represented women in STEM and struggles that they go through. But I don't want to discount the fact that this was also like a very funny book. There were times where the humor was what really lightened up the situations of some heavier topics that were in here. So it was still very entertaining, but it really, to me, was accurate based on my experiences and things that I know that happened. Another historical fiction I read that I don't physically have because I actually lent it to my mother is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. This book is about 2 sisters in France during World War II, and it follows their separate stories and how they're being impacted by the war and what they're doing to either help with it directly or to help people that are affected by it indirectly. So this tells 2 very different stories. These sisters had different experiences that were both very impactful and both very helpful for the war efforts for France, but both very different. I liked how it showed completely different experiences for them because of who they were individually and where their circumstances were, and then how they came together and both had an effect on what was happening and each other's lives still, even though they were so separate during this time. The last book I want to talk about that is also considered historical fiction is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This book follows a band as they're developing and becoming more popular and growing. They pick up this singer, Daisy, when they start to get more famous as a lead for them to go along with their lead male singer. The most interesting part of this book was that it's told in interview format, so it makes the story very personal because you're getting the experience from the band members themselves and their interpretation of what happened. This was also kind of a romance as well. This is considered historical fiction if you look it up, but it's also a pretty heavy romance novel, which Taylor Jenkins Reid is pretty well known for writing. But this book reminded me, and I think it's supposed to be like a Fleetwood Mac situation. There were a lot of turmoils that this band went through together, so seeing it from everyone's perspective and not just your main characters was kind of interesting because you see how it was affecting the rest of the band and not just the 2 main characters. And just a little side note, I know that Daisy Jones and the Six was an Amazon show, and I believe Lessons in Chemistry was an Apple TV show. They're both out. And I've heard that The Nightingale is supposed to be made into a movie, and I think that the Fanning sisters are supposed to play the sisters in the book. I've heard that. I've seen that it's kind of online, but these deals fall through all the time. But I do know that Daisy Jones and the Six and Lessons in Chemistry have been made into TV shows on streaming. I have one dystopian novel that I want to discuss, and that is Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng. So this book is about a 12-year-old American boy and his mother who are of Chinese descent, and they're living in a world that is trying to preserve American nationalism so much, and there's such a strong hatred of China that anybody that even tries to partake in any part of that type of culture is punished. So this boy knows that his mother writes poetry and speaks out against American nationalism. So he's disavowed her his entire life, but then he gets this letter that makes him want to go find her and find out more about her cause and why she's fighting for what she's fighting for. And basically what he discovers is that there's this underground community of people that are helping children that have been displaced because they've been taken away from their parents for various reasons. And there's an entire network of people that are trying to help those that have been affected by this hatred towards Chinese Americans. I'm not going to get into the reasons why this book really impacted me, but it was surprisingly, I felt a lot when I read this book. I obviously rated it very highly. I think it was a 4.5 for me, but I didn't think it would affect me as much as it did. And it made me think a lot about what we do as a society that maybe we don't intend to be harmful to other cultures, but that's just our nature. So it definitely makes me think twice about certain things I say or do. I really enjoyed this. I read her book, Little Fires Everywhere, earlier in the year as well, and I enjoyed it, but this book was a lot more impactful on me than Little Fires Everywhere was. Definitely read this. It's not a happy book by any means, but I think it's something that will make you think about where we are as a culture, where we are as humans in this world right now, and how we're treating each other. And it's kind of eye-opening to see that from a different perspective. I have 2 romance novels to discuss, which is surprising for me because I very rarely rate romance novels high. They all kind of, in my mind, follow the same type of storyline. There's always that third act conflict, then they get back together. It's nice to read when you want to break from some heavier things, but again, they're all pretty predictable in my opinion. The first is another Taylor Jenkins Reid novel, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This follows a journalist that has been hand-selected by Evelyn Hugo to give a one-on-one interview, which she's never done before. She's been very private about her life and her reasons for doing what she's done. But she's towards the end of her life now, and she wants her story told, and she wants it told the way she wants it. So she hand-selects this journalist and begins to tell her story of her life and her 7 husbands and why she ended up marrying them and what the reasonings were and what she learned basically from each of those relationships and how it got her to where she was in her career and her life. We do find that there is a reason that this journalist was selected. There is a pretty eye-opening twist at the end that I thought was very interesting. To hear about the struggles that Evelyn went through and why she basically leaned on these men to help carry her through her career was very interesting. It was very interestingly told. And to find out who she really is and what her real feelings are was also pretty cool. I wasn't expecting some of the things that happened in this book, so I really enjoyed it. And the other romance novel that is quite possibly one of my favorite books of all time I read this year was The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This book, I couldn't put it down. Ashley writes these, I talk like I know her, magical realism types of romances. She also wrote The Dead Romantics, which I read this year, and I really enjoyed it, but it was not, I rated it a 4, so I'm not including it in this list. But this book is about a girl who inherits her great aunt's apartment in New York City, and she was very close with this aunt. She spent a lot of time in this apartment as a child. She used to travel a lot with this aunt, and she's grieving the loss of her aunt throughout this book. So that's a big part of the story as well. And her aunt always told her this apartment was magical, but she never really questioned it. She also warned her, don't ever fall in love in this apartment. So one day she's on her way home from work, and she enters the apartment, and it looks different than she left it. So it has some of her aunt's things that she had gotten rid of there, and it just seems like her stuff's missing. She walks into the kitchen and there's this guy sitting there. So our main character, Clementine, is confused as to why this guy, Ewan, and he also goes by James, is in her apartment. And then she realizes that she's actually 7 years in her past and he's 7 years in her future, in his future. She's 7 years in his future. There's a 7-year time gap. Her present time, his 7 years in the past. It's confusing, but it makes sense. So they get to know each other throughout the beginning of this book via the apartment and via different parts of their lives than like it would be now if she met him now. And the thing about this apartment is it's not every time that she goes home that it's like that. It almost like decides when she needs to see him in that light versus when she just wants to see him. So it was very interesting that it happened when it needed to and not all the time. And then they end up meeting in current time and have to like rectify and have to like deal with the fact that he's not who he was 7 years ago, and he's dealing with her as someone 7 years older who has a different life now. So that was pretty much the conflict that occurred in this book. It was very beautifully done. The story was very well told. I loved the main male character in this book. I thought he was perfect. I just kept texting my sister. I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm in love with this fictional character. So definitely one of the best romances I've ever read and one of my top books from this year. And now I'm going to discuss 3 fantasy novels that they're not standalones, but they're the only book in the series that I read this year. They're also all the first book in their series. I know you're probably thinking 3 books is not a lot of fantasy books to have on my top. This is, I think, going to be 15 books. But a lot of fantasy books I read this year are part of a series. So the series video will be very fantasy heavy. So the first one we'll talk about is Divine Rivals. This will be the first book in a duology, and the second book, Ruthless Vows, will actually be released, I think, the day after Christmas, so it won't be a book I read this year. This book is by Rebecca Ross, and it is about 2 rival journalists that are working for the same newspaper and competing for the one permanent full-time position that this newspaper has. There is a subplot going on in the background that's not too prevalent in this book, but I believe it will be in the second, which is that there's a war going on between 2 gods, and that's what a lot of these stories that they're writing are based on. And where they're living, they can only write in the favor of one god. They can't write in favor of the other. But nobody really knows what's going on at the front lines. So our characters, Iris and Roman, both have these magical typewriters. And Iris's brother went to fight in this war, and she has not heard from him, does not know what happened to him, where he is, his fate, anything like that. So she's been writing these letters and just kind of shoving them under her closet door because she can't send them to him. She finds out that they are actually being sent somewhere, and she didn't know where until she gets a letter back one night, and it's from Roman. She doesn't know it's him. He knows that he's writing to Iris, but she doesn't know that he's the one responding. So they grow to like know each other and become really close through these letters. Obviously one-sided because, like I said, he's the only one that knows who the other is. She decides that she wants to actually go to the front lines and be a journalist from that perspective. So that's where she ends up going, and you get more of the war part of it at that point. And then the book kind of goes from there without getting into too much detail. Things unravel. Obviously, she eventually finds out that it's him that's writing the letters. And there's a pretty big cliffhanger at the end that I think is going to lead to a very exciting, more action-packed second book, but I don't know. I consider this book a fantasy book for romance lovers. So it was very heavy on the romance, and there was that little inkling of fantasy in the background. I'm hoping the second book is a little higher on the fantasy side, like the high stakes side, and a little less on the romance since we got so much of it in the first book. But we'll see. I still really enjoyed it. It was very beautifully written, and I think that's why I liked it so much and why it was such a popular book this year. And like I said, I think it's only going to be 2 books, so it'll be nice to like get that one out of the way probably pretty early in the year. Another book that is the first in its, I believe, going to be a trilogy that I actually just finished and very much enjoyed, probably again a contender for one of my favorite books of the year, is Powerless by Lauren Roberts. This book has been described like very similar to The Hunger Games. I think it's a little bit more fantasy. The Hunger Games to me was, I think, more dystopian. This is definitely more fantasy because these people have powers, where in The Hunger Games they just fought physically. In this world, there's elites and there's ordinaries. And the elites think that the ordinaries are destroying their powers and weakening their bloodlines, so they basically hunt them and exile them, and if they find them in the kingdom, they're supposed to die. So our main character in this book is Peyton Gray, and she's an ordinary. She lives in what's considered like the slums of the kingdom, so she's not living like high on the hog. She doesn't have family. She's only got her one friend, and she has to steal to survive. Our other main character in this is Kai, who is the second born to the king. So he's a prince, but he's not the heir to the throne. So his destiny is to basically be the enforcer, I think they call him. So he will eventually be in charge of going out and hunting the ordinaries and killing them. He already is sent on missions to do that now, but he has to prove himself to fully take over the position. One day the prince is like in the slums area, and Peyton sees him and doesn't realize who he is. And she wants to like rob him. And then she eventually sees him again, but he's being beaten by an elite that has actually also been exiled because their powers are considered dangerous and too strong to the other elites. So she steps in and saves his life. Because of that, Peyton is entered into this purging trials competition that they have, where you have to be voted in by the people in the kingdom. And Kai is also in that as well, and this is kind of his test to see if he's ready to become the enforcer. So throughout this, there's like a lot of trials. There is a lot of violence in this book, I think. I don't think this is YA. There's romance, but it's like zero spice, so it could be considered YA, but it was a little more violent than I would think a YA book would be. How many times can I say YA? It's them growing closer throughout the trials without her revealing that she's an ordinary. She has to like fake a power that basically a mundane human could have. And obviously her life is in danger at all times, because if they find out she's an ordinary, they're just going to kill her. Again, another fantastically cliffhangery ending. I can't wait for the second book to come out. I believe it comes out in July. It's called Reckless. And like I said, I think it's slated to be a trilogy. So hopefully within the next year or two, the third book comes out as well, and we'll have the conclusion to this so far pretty wonderful story. And the final fantasy novel I'm going to talk about, of course, is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. I do not own Iron Flame yet. It is out. This is supposed to be, I think, a 5-book series, and Iron Flame just came out. I will read that probably at the beginning of next year. I don't want to rush read it at the end of the year. I think I'm getting it for the holidays. So Fourth Wing is about a girl named Violet and a guy, Xaden, who are both in the writers quadrant of this university in their kingdom. So once you hit a certain age, you have to join one of the quadrants. There's a scribe, there's like a medic one, there's the riders, which is the dragon fighters, and I can never remember the fourth one, but there's 4 of them. And Violet trained her whole life to be a scribe, but then her mother decides, nope, you're going to have to be a dragon rider. So she's pretty much convinced she's going to die before this even starts, because there's trials and tasks that they have to complete like immediately once they sign their papers and try to go into the part of the university that this quadrant takes. Has their lessons and trials and whatever. So Violet's pretty convinced she's just going to die, as a lot of people do trying to become a dragon rider. If you pass all of the trials and meet the dragons, and one of them chooses to bond with you, then you become a dragon rider and you train with the dragon. Xaden is also part of this quadrant, and he is considered a wing leader. So he's in charge of one of the larger groups that are like divided out. He is also the son of a man that was considered like the rebel leader for, again, an underlying war that is going on. So all of the kids of these people that were considered rebels are forced to enter the Dragon Riders quadrant, because basically they're hoping that they'll just die during the trials and everything, and they won't have to deal with these kids. But a lot of them actually have made it through, Xaden being one of them. So this is a little bit of like an enemies to lovers romance. It's not a slow burn. It actually happened, I think, pretty quickly. There's a lot of miscommunication, I think, that happens between them, but there's an immediate attraction and an immediate understanding that they're going to be the main characters. I really enjoyed this book once Violet bonded with a dragon, because I just thought her dragon's personality was fantastic. And when you bond with a dragon, your minds like meld and you can talk basically telepathically. And the banter that went on in her head between her and the dragon was just excellent. So I'm looking forward to Iron Flame. I've heard good things about it. I am trying so hard to avoid spoilers, but I have seen some ratings and they're coming out very good, which makes me happy. But I'm interested to see how the story progresses because, yes, again, there was a cliffhanger at the end of this and a very big reveal. So I can't wait to see how that picks up at the beginning of the next book. And we'll close out with thrillers. So the first thriller I'm going to discuss, so first up is Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. I have read all of Alice Feeney's novels except her newest one, which I just haven't read it yet, which is Good Bad Girl. I love her thrillers. I love her writing. And Rock, Paper, Scissors definitely stood out to me within her books. So this book is about this couple that is kind of on their last thread. They're basically both in the mindset that they're probably going to get divorced because they don't think they can salvage their relationship. And the wife wins a trip at work to go spend, I think, like just a long weekend, maybe a week in the Scottish Highlands at this church that was renovated into a place that you can stay. So they head out on this trip. They get there. The weather's bad. It's very snowy. They basically realize they're stuck there until the weather clears, so they just try to make the best of it. They're in this old kind of creepy church in this very abandoned seeming town. There's really nobody else around them. And they start to question each other and if they're being stalked by somebody outside because all these weird things start to happen. And that's the premise of the book. Who can you trust? What's actually going on? Why are they there in the first place? And the ending of this book was like perfect. Almost a 5-star thriller. None of these thrillers were 5 stars. I don't know that I've ever given a thriller a 5-star, but they were all 4.5, which still is a very high rating for these. Another favorite thriller author of mine is Ruth Ware. Again, I'm caught up on her except for her most recent book. But there were 2 this year that I read that I very much enjoyed. The first was The Woman in Cabin 10. This is about a journalist who is trying to recover from a break-in that happened in her house that has her kind of shook. So she gets invited on this exclusive cruise ship to be basically an influencer and document her time and write about it and get people excited for it. It's the like maiden voyage for this cruise. A very small ship. There's only 10 cabins. Woman in Cabin 10. And she's right across the hallway from Cabin 10. She meets this woman when she goes to borrow mascara from her the first night, but then notices that she's not at the welcome party. So she keeps asking people if someone's missing, like, wasn't there another guest? And they're like, we don't know who you're talking about. That night, she's woken by a struggle and the sound of a body hitting the water. And she knows someone has just been thrown off the ship. She actually, I think, goes out onto her balcony and sees, like, the body sinking. So, obviously, she's alarmed. And she's trying to get to the bottom of this. She's asking people what happened, if anyone else heard anything. Where's this woman that nobody else has seen but me? This larger plot begins to unfold with, obviously, some of the other characters. I didn't really expect it to go where it went. And then when it went there, she took it a step further to end it. So I really enjoyed this one. It's probably, that might be my favorite of all her books that I read. Maybe. But she writes great thriller novels in general, so definitely recommend that one, and I just kind of recommend anything she writes. The other book that stood out for me from her this year was The It Girl. This is about a group of friends from university. I think they went to Oxford. And you follow April, who was the It Girl, as well as pretty much Hannah and Will are the other 2 main characters. It starts in present time in Hannah's perspective, and she's married to Will. They're expecting their first child, and she's having these flashbacks to the time when she was in Oxford and living with April, and you find out that April was actually murdered while they were there. It always kind of bothered her that she never really thought the right person was convicted for this, and when that person dies in jail, it offsets all of these new theories, and did he do it? He claimed his innocence till the end, and so she starts second-guessing everything. So you're going back in time and seeing their lives at university and meeting April and understanding how she was, which was pretty much manipulative, and she was dating Will, who's now Hannah's husband, while they were at university. So you kind of question a lot, like, do we have an unreliable narrator here? What's really going on? You meet their other friends that they had at university, and eventually the true story unravels. I think, if I remember correctly, figured out the end, like, right before it happened, but it was still shocking how she revealed it and how it ended. So if you like rich people drama, this is kind of like that. Privilege, all of that kind of things are very prevalent in here, and how it doesn't always end up helping you in the end. Next up, I have actually 3 Book of the Month books that I got this year that are all thrillers. Typically, that's what I get from Book of the Month, but not always. The first is Megan Golden's Dark Corners. This is actually the second book in a... I don't want to say you have to read the first book to read this one, but it follows Rachel Kroll, who is a podcaster, a true crime podcaster. And in the first book, she follows her first trial live for a sexual assault case that happened in this one town, and ends up unraveling another case that happened that's related to the one currently going on in the same town. So the first book's about her solving that crime. This book puts Rachel more in the victim seat. She's called down to this jail in Florida by these FBI agents because there's a guy about to be released from prison, and an influencer that Madison, I think her name was, who's very popular, has gone missing. And right before she went missing, she visited this prisoner, and they could hear in their conversation, I can't remember if they heard it or if he wrote it on a piece of paper and they could read it on the camera, where her name was mentioned, like, you need to get her involved, because I think he was trying to prove that he was innocent in things that they were thinking he was guilty of. So they call her down there. She has no idea what's going on. She doesn't know this man. She doesn't know anything about him in his case. And then the actual bad guy ends up finding out that she's involved and targets her, and it just becomes more high stakes in that case. So she doesn't really want to be involved because she knows it's putting her in danger, but she also feels like it's her duty to report this back as a podcaster of true crime. So this was definitely more high stakes and interesting of the two. I enjoyed both of the books, but this one, for a second book, surprised me that I liked it more. But if you like true crime podcasts, like myself, which is why I was drawn to this book, highly recommend this one, as well as the first book, which is Night Swim, but I rated this one above a 4, so that's why it's on the list. The next book is What Lies in the Woods by Kate Alice Marshall. This was my first book by her, but I actually ended up getting her new release as well from Book of the Month this past month that comes out in January, so I'm hoping to read that again at the beginning of the year. This book, I think, reminded me a lot of this Slenderman case. It's about these 3 friends that, as children, used to go into the woods and play games together, and I think they call it the goddess game, where they'd go find these little hideaway spots and make magic and stuff like that. And then one day they're in the woods and one of them ends up getting attacked and stabbed. She survives, and they end up putting a man behind bars, a serial killer behind bars. Now, while this man, I'm pretty sure, was an actual serial killer, he maintained his innocence on this crime until the end. As he's fighting the fact that he's like, I did not do this, this was not me, I wasn't involved, their girls are liars. They're now living through this as adults and having to experience all this trauma and try to remember what actually happened and not what their minds are telling them happened or what they've convinced themselves actually happened. So there's a lot of inner battles of, okay, my mind is telling me it was this, but what actually did happen? What is my mind trying to protect me from, essentially? But it did remind me a lot of the Slenderman case, because it was the 2 girls that went into the woods intentionally to try to kill their friend and were unsuccessful. So I think that's what drew me to this book in the first place, but this does not follow that storyline exactly, so still a little different. Again, shocking and very interesting. Different type of read than a lot of the, like, my friends all go into the woods and we all start getting picked off one by one, which is what a lot of thrillers are. Not that I don't like that, I do, but this was just like a different type of story. And the last book, ironically, The Last Word by Taylor Adams. I've heard wonderful things about Taylor Adams, so I obviously picked up this book when I saw it as an option for my book of the month. And I started it at like 6 p.m. on a Friday night and finished it that night. I know, I have such exciting Friday nights. When you're in your 30s, what else are you going to do? I'm not going to go drink. It's not what I do anymore. So I started it and finished it in one night, basically because his stories are very gripping, but they're also just scary enough that you want to know how it's going to end so you can sleep. So this book's about a girl that is house sitting in this like remote beach town. You find that she's like trying to deal with some things going on in her life and figuring out what she wants. So she gets away. Her and her dog go stay in this house. They're house sitting. And she makes friends with a neighbor, an older man that's a neighbor, and they communicate like via telescope. Like they write on boards and talk to each other. She's a reader, and she has her like Kindle or whatever they call it, e-reader, and he recommends her to read this book. She reads it and hates it and leaves a 1-star review on this website where the author sees it and then basically starts harassing her online. When she refuses to take down the 1-star rating, the online harassment turns more into real life harassment. Because, somebody is like stalking her and trying to get into this house. It gets pretty violent at one point, but it is so fast paced and so twisty. The ending like gave me so much whiplash because you thought you knew what was happening, and then he's like, nope, this is going to happen. And then he's like, oh, just kidding. I got you again. This is going to happen. So I loved this book. It was almost a 5-star read for me. It actually, I may bump it in my mind to a 5-star read at some point because I still think about this book to this day. I don't like to rate books 5 stars if I didn't truly connect with the characters. And in thrillers, it's very hard, in my opinion, to connect with the characters because you're with them for such a short amount of time. And he also had a scene in here where he had me way too worried about a dog, and I don't like that. So don't mess with the dogs. Don't make me think something's going to happen to a dog, and don't do anything to a dog in a book, or I will not like it. But if you're looking for a thriller that is very fast-paced, high stakes, constant things happening, short period of time, because the other book I read by him, No Exit, was similar in the timeline, was like one night. All of this happens in one night. So there's just a lot going on. Then so far from what I've read, he's your guy for that kind of a book. I've enjoyed both of them. This one definitely more than No Exit. Highly recommend this author, and I've only read 2 of his books. I plan on trying to read more of his books in 2024 if I find the time. All right, so those are my 15-column standalone books that I would recommend based on the 150-plus books that I read in 2023. I will be doing a video, like I said, on series that I will recommend. I think I narrowed it down to like 10. I read like 17 series or something this year. That will be coming at some point. I'm very much looking forward. I had a pretty good reading year, and I'm very much looking forward to what 2024 holds. I hope I gave you a good recommendation, maybe something you haven't read that sounds interesting, or maybe you've read some of these books and either agree or completely disagree with me when I recommend them, but that's what's lovely about books is we all have our own opinions and it's fine. All right, guys, so thanks for watching, and I will see you soon.